Okay, it's being live streamed, so I assume yes. So I'll turn off my camera during the speeches, but I'll listen, don't worry. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to call upon Prime Minister.
Hey, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you. 3, 2, 1. What I'll do in this speech is relatively straightforward. I'll discuss briefly the framing of how we think this is likely to occur and how it interacts with potential backlash. Then bring in 2 pieces of context for how religion currently operates and specifically how it operates in conjunction with the state. And then discuss why there is a need for this funding, as well as the benefits that it can confer to people, both people who leave their religion, but also to people who choose not to, even after exposure to this information and contact with it. First, how is this likely to be done? We read CA clarifications, and therefore we're going to give you analysis for why this is dominantly something that happens within a country itself. I think there are 3 reasons for this. The first is that countries, generally speaking, devote significantly more of their money within their own country, and specifically to like political and religious organizations within it, e.g. like development aid, under which this strictly falls if you do it abroad, even though it's probably not necessarily development aid, is something like a 2%, I think, of oftentimes budgets, meaning that you don't wind up aggregating a huge amount of resources there, and adding to the amount of development aid oftentimes comes with significant backlash. Secondly, it is something that gets you significantly more votes domestically, because you at the very least access a group of people who care about this or who find it sympathetic or who have benefited from this individually. The third reason for this is that it's significantly easier to do in terms of you having the resources to set up these organizations in the language, and specific to the experience of people that are actually within your country, as opposed to a country and a religion that you have significantly less of a relationship with. How do we think this is likely to be done? I think these organizations aren't stupid, and I don't think that they're edgy atheists like we see on the internet. I think the reason for that is that oftentimes they are faced with a genuine situation where the reason that they're doing this in the first place is that they have experienced or observed significant damages that religion has done to people's liberty and self-determination, as well as just materially to their ability to live their life as they want, and like materially to them oftentimes in terms of specifically bad dynamics. I think that they will want to pursue the most effective route possible of reaching out to those, and specifically also in the cases where this is people who have experienced the situation of having to leave a religion themselves because they could no longer stay within it, to do it in a way that is most empathetic for that. I think crucially, even people who leave their religion understand that there are people within that religion who are not bad people, meaning that I don't think they are likely to stereotype. I think they're likely to use a messaging of you can love your parents and still not want to be within the same religion as them, because for you specifically, this is unbearable. I think they are likely to discuss specific examples of abuse, as opposed to saying all religion is inherently abusive for everyone, specifically because that is likelier to appeal to people, because people aren't willing to say everything that they were ever connected to with a religious experience, e.g. good experiences they had in their childhood, or a particularly nice priest was awful. People are likely to respond to the characterization of specific experiences they had as being bad, in terms of that religion radically limiting their ability to live their life as they want, according to their own experience of sexuality or gender, or according to how they otherwise want to live. I think specifically as a result of that, there is likely to be relatively limited backlash. One, because the cases that are selected as the advocacy for why this is needed are likely to be ones that most religions agree are universally bad, e.g. forms of local abuse of authority. But secondly, religions can oftentimes also argue that even though these organizations exist and they're preaching their silly atheism, people are staying with us because we're not abusive like that, and this congregation is a good place, meaning that in most situations, this is not actually likely to be something particularly bad. Second point of framing. Religion is incredibly determinative of your identity. Oftentimes values of what is right and wrong, what you can consider about yourself and what might be acceptable to you, what identities you can explore in terms of how they would be acceptable, not just to your own social environment, but crucially to the divine and your ability to enter heaven, are things that are entrenched on you from a very early age, and from which you have very limited ability to escape unless you have it explained to you by someone who understands your experience, not someone who was necessarily an atheist from the beginning and never experienced a relationship with religion in the first place, to free yourself from. I think specifically that is something that religion can do really, really well, but crucially it can also go wrong, because religions have capacity for abuse of authority by local priests or leaders, because oftentimes they are in a position of authority where it is hard to question, because they are considered anointed by the divine, meaning that mundane questioning does not work. But secondly, oftentimes they are protected by a hierarchy of like their religion, insofar as that church needs people to respect that authority, because otherwise the level upward of the particular local priest won't be respected, meaning there's limited amount of accountability. Given that churches oftentimes receive things like tax exemptions on the massive amount of land that they own, given that oftentimes they get specific benefits from states as well, we think it is reasonable to, in those situations, owe people the reparatory duty that at the point where this goes wrong and this support by the state enables these religions to do harm upon people, to give them the maximal amount of ability to liberate themselves from that. As a result of that, there is a significant need for these organizations. In order to create and fund them, you need a significant amount of both money and social connection, because you need to set up an organization. At the point where you have left by yourself and you don't have that kind of support network, I don't think that people are willing to set up these organizations, insofar as they probably feel relatively isolated and they don't necessarily want further conflict for fear of potential backlash or further backlash from their community, insofar as the experience of leaving has likely been quite traumatic. At the point where you provide funding and connection between people with this experience, for these organizations to like actually come into existence, people are likelier to contribute their experience. Sorry, Miri will take you away from opening. Meaning that you wind up with these organizations actually being able to come into existence in the first place, but also crucially provide spots of connection and information sharing between people who are in it. I think specifically the other reason why there is need for this in Western liberal democracies particularly is there is wide sympathy for this among people who are broadly secular, insofar as they're not familiar with the degree to which a religion can be coercive. But even if they were, they don't have the knowledge necessary in order to address it well, because they don't share the experience and they don't relate to it. The benefits that accrue from this are straightforward. I think the first thing that these organizations do is they provide information that is in the language and specific to the experience of people who might be experiencing a bad situation with religion. I think given the modern age where you can casually interact with quite a lot of information at the point where it is provided and targeted for you, that means that you are likely to be able to access this. I think this is good, A, because it allows people who genuinely feel bad within their religion to mentally liberate themselves from that to a degree, because they get the perspective and the hope that you can change and it won't necessarily hurt you. But secondly, I think it also allows you to improve your own religion insofar as like your relation with religion, even if you stay, because you know there's a way out, meaning you feel it less coercive upon you, because you know that you have the option of going away, so things weigh less on you at the point where they're maybe not ideal. Secondly, I think they massively increase your ability to actually leave. Note that religion, in terms of social networks, in terms of the fact that it's often dominant within a locality and therefore providing jobs, etc., is highly stigmatized to leave. It is immensely difficult to do so. It oftentimes means being disinherited and losing money and a home that you needed. These organizations provide the shelters and the support that people need in order to actually have a meaningful choice about their religion, which we owe to them. For all of those reasons, opening government.
I would like to thank Speaker very much for a speech, and now I'd like to invite the first speaker for the opposition.
Hi, you're able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Lovely. I think what's important to understand about the way in which OG has missed this motion is that a large variety of resources exist in the status quo to be able to target these people, to help them leave, all of which we stand for on our side as well. I think this looks like individuals who have left religion, like myself, who actively reach out to the exact people that OG is concerned about to provide what OG exactly thinks is important in terms of someone who understands their experiences and wants to help them. OG then says that we need the government to do this because people like me are afraid of community backlash and afraid of isolation. I, one, don't think that ex-religious individuals face embrace isolation, the moment at which they receive broad spread social support, the moment at which they receive pedestaling and platforming by the progressive community is a phenomenal example of what empathetic outreach looks like in order to be able to create cascading effects within those communities. I'm also not really concerned about community backlash, given I'm an ex-member of that community and I've already chosen to leave it, probably for really important structural reasons, such as my queerness, meaning that I particularly value that community's response less. I think secondarily, all the atheists that exist on their side of the house might be working for these organizations, still create these types of organizations, tops of nonprofits on our side, just without the government funding, without the government execution, without the perception of government puppeteering, manipulation, and instrumentalization. I think thirdly, you see broad societal efforts in order to be able to educate people and provide them access to a meaningful and consensual choice about whether or not they engage in relationships, precisely because of societal concerns and anxieties about the ways in which people are being manipulated by religion for the precise reasons that OG cases for us. I think fourthly, you also see massive online resources, amazing subreddits and forums that people who previously were in very coercive religious situations, like myself, are able to access and use to organically pull ourselves out of that situation if it's really just as easy as hearing from someone else's experience who went through, which means they largely see no meaningful change except a variety of deltas that will spin into three parts of this case. One, not only inefficacies, but creations of particularly pernicious challenges. Secondarily, what the counterfactual on our side looks like and why it's much better. Thirdly, how this creates whitewashing. One, why is it that their policy is uniquely ineffective? Because the types of people who are most in need of this type of support are not what this nonprofit is providing. I think that one, oftentimes people who are most entrenched within religious communities do not have the financial capacity to leave because of the ways in which they provide financial resources to the church through tithes every week, through the ways in which the church has persuaded them to stay within that community, not move for better job access, not argue for a promotion because it's probably better in order to be able to let God's will act upon themselves. These nonprofits don't give them the financial mobility to leave or extricate themselves from that. I think secondarily, people stay in religions because they perceive themselves to live in an existential situation that makes them feel anxious and concerned about their very existence in this universe, nothing of which the nonprofit provides them solvency for. I think thirdly, they face interpersonal restrictions whereby their parents or their partners prevents them from going to the types of spaces that would be exposed to the nonprofit that government is talking about. I think fourthly, even if you would, you feel a sense of obligation to that community, that even talking with a nonprofit doesn't break your sense of filial piety, your sense of betraying the spiritual connection that you have with these people, even if you're questioning it, even if it feels abusive to you. I think fifth and finally, even if you're questioning it precisely because you view this institution to be coercive and aggressive. And so the delta on their side of not just having these organizations, but having these organizations be publicly funded and executed on by the state gives these people who are already afraid of institutional coercion the perception that this isn't just another organization, but rather it is another institution who's trying to come in, puppeteer, manipulate, and take their agency away from them, which makes them unlikely to reach out to you especially, and actually makes them more likely to stay where they are in terms of the past release resistance and give in to the situation that they're in. But I think the second broad cluster of reasons why it is that they're ineffective is that this is perceived to be cleaving the divide between the separation of church and state within Western liberal democracies, which is hyper fetishized as a reason whereby they are seen, or they propagandize to their own populations why they are better than other religious nations around the world, particularly in the global south, because they are unable to meaningfully provide that separation of church and state, which means that you then create demand within these communities that if you're breaking that cleavage, if you're reaching out to those religions, or if you're reaching out to the atheists, you ought also reach out to religious communities as well. You ought also create unique resources in order to symmetrically be able to provide from us, because we are all your citizens, which means it creates unique demand and unique pressure on the state to create other forms of funding that then cancel out the own efforts that it's making with these nonprofits. I think the second thing, though, is that it actually creates a legal precedent to justify consolidation of power for religious communities. Because when religious communities can say the state is no longer acting objectively and maintaining this separation, therefore, if that separation doesn't matter anymore, this is where we want to see certain things taken out of curriculums in schools, or certain things like abstinence education inserted on the basis that there is no delineation between church and state anymore. So rather, we can see more and more encroachment of religious influence in the daily types of schools and education experiences that not only affect religious communities, but affect all the students within that school system. I think the third cluster response is that religious communities are going to fight back. There's going to be massive lawsuits, public campaigns. It's going to become a talking point in presidential debates and become a huge focus of public discourse. Why does this matter? One, because it further prevents the nonprofits from seeing any efficacy. Secondarily, though, because it has knockoff political effects, such as like moderates like my parents, who are fairly progressive, but also fairly conservative in certain ways, and who see the enshrinement of church and state as really meaningful to their construction of their national identity. And when they see the state blocking that, it makes them more amenable to go back and backslide to the religious community from whence they came, because they don't view the liberal state that they're trying to enter as morally superior or morally defensible anymore. And so you see more consolidation and sliding towards far right votes, especially important when we have upcoming elections. But then I think what the counterfactual looks like like is a couple of things. The first is that we actually see organic change towards challenging religion. I think this looks like a couple of things. One, rising liberalism, globalization around the world through things like the proliferation of democratic apparatuses, through things like neocolonialism, the fact that we have technology that provides access to resources and information to people all over the world, other types of innovation like chemical fertilizers that increase people's capacity to extract socioeconomic support from the same amount of resources they have in their life, all of which increases people's socioeconomic feeling of security, all of which increases people's knowledge about their place in the universe, all of which increases people's exposure to other forms and walks of life, which makes them less reliant on the religions that they are in, which makes them less secure and existentially scared, which make them less likely to seek out those religions in the first place, and gives them access to information and knowledge about how to resist those religions if they find themselves in that situation, which means we have organic change on our side that they are blocking. Yeah, POICG?
So your argument is that the line between the state and the church is now going to be limited, and therefore the state is going to...
Sorry, I didn't understand that. We had multiple arguments on that front, though you can't group it into one. The second trajectory that we're defending in the status quo is that you see massive access to resources online that help people learn about the ways in which they can change and about the criticisms of their religion, which is, for example, how I found out about the restriction of religious rights and the historic oppression of queer stories from history through Judeo-Christian history. I think, thirdly, we see broad requirements that are not seen as specifically targeting religion, like requiring all people to access a certain form of education versus creating certain organizations that are seen as targeting religion specifically. I think the fourth thing is that you see the recent wave of public controversy around massive scandals like priest abuse that are making people more and more critical of religion in the status quo, which means in the status quo, we see a rising trend of atheism and of secularism that is organic, that is multi-pronged and therefore hard for religion to resist, and is also making those leaders desperate, which means that we could see the continued action of that, or you could step in and then trigger their desperation to result in far more withdrawal from public resources like the nonprofits you're talking about, but also forms of public welfare and health. See more in socialization and indoctrination within churches against the state, making people disalign their religious identity from their national state, who would make it harder for the state to reach out to them in the first place. I think, in summation, it's a particularly ineffective policy, and it actually creates huge cascading socioeconomic harms. The counterfactual is much better, and I also don't think that religions will take this standing down. Proud to oppose.
I would like to thank Speaker for a speech. And now, without any further ado, would like to call upon the second speaker for the government.
Panel, given that we hear from opening opposition that there is already a trend towards liberalization and towards people leaving religious communities who lack the resources to be able to do this effectively, but at the same time, some of them have enough resources, I'm unsure why adding one additional resource that is likely to massively increase the availability of help required and the visibility of these options is something that is a bad thing, right? Because I am very happy, Josh, that your experience leaving a religion was a very positive one and that you didn't have any major hindrances from doing so. However, what we do see in many communities across Western liberal democracies is that there are many people who do not have access to the resources they needed. And Kat already talks about this in her speech. Kat talks about how you obviously need people who are able to talk you through what you're going through and who are able to set a positive example of this having been done successfully before so you can succeed as well. But what crucially Kat also models is the fact that you now also have access to the kinds of resources that you might need access to when you're leaving your community, when you're probably leaving your job, when you probably don't have much to start a life with, and also the kind of community that is being provided. Now, we are not claiming that none of these can be provided in any other way, and obviously we welcome any other grassroots movements or grassroots organizations providing access to this. However, I am unsure how, given how many people are likely to want to benefit from this, I'm unsure how this can solely be funded by people who have themselves gone through it. And we already see that there is a lot of support available in terms of seeing examples of people who have done it, but there isn't so much support available in terms of access to free counseling and free therapy and access to getting access to housing and support while you're finding a job and setting up a new life, simply because the community can't necessarily afford to provide this to individuals, even if they might want to. And that is where state funding is essential for allowing this and for allowing an actual successful transition towards a non-religious life, right? But what we also see, and Kat crucially explains to you, that the framing done on these organizations is going to be very, very careful and very nuanced, and is going to target particularly the cases where individuals need them rather than a propaganda by the state to try to turn everyone towards atheism, right? So I think that the backlash that is going to be done, that is going to be created by this is rather limited. And I don't think that this is necessarily going to become a leading political issue that is going to take up a lot of airspace and turn everyone against it, right? But also, I think that there is clearly, like, OO tries to frame this as the only way this would be legitimate is if the state would also provide a lot of help to religious people, and then it would kind of cancel it out. Notice that CAT also already tells you that we are providing a lot of financial and many other types of support for religion, a lot of legal protections that are being given to religions, a lot of tax breaks that account to millions of essential state subsidizes being given to major religions all across Western liberal democracies. So this isn't the case of we are disadvantaging religion by giving atheists or people trying to leave religion an additional benefit, but rather, if anything, it is more evening out a play field because religions are already heavily subsidized by the state, and now we are also heavily subsidizing the people who want to leave religion. Kat has already explained to you why the way this is going to be framed is probably going to be done in a way that only individuals who are seeking to leave the religion are going to be the ones that are going to be targeted by these institutions and are going to profit from them, right? Because for everyone else, seeing an info session on how you have options to get support by the state if you want to leave your religion or if you want to leave your religious community, if you are truly a believer who is happy with the religion and doesn't desire to leave the community, you are just going to look at it, you're going to maybe laugh at it or maybe get annoyed by it and then keep walking past, right? So the kinds of people that will actually respond to this kind of messaging are also are either people who definitely would like to leave their religions because of they're oppressed in different ways, or people who are at least questioning whether they're belonging to that religion and to that religious community, something that is beneficial for them. And it might be that after they seek out counseling and they resolve some of the tensions they might have, they decide they want to stay with the religion. But that is already a massive win on our side of the house, because then the people who are deciding to remain engaged in the religious community are doing so out of their own choice rather than because they don't see an alternative out and because that is the only way they have been raised into. I will take closing.
So all are right and you are wrong. All of those resources, info sessions, like fucking Reddit, all of these exist in status quo and people are free to engage with them. You fail the burden of explaining why this is a necessary sort of thing.
I mean, yes, like OO has already asserted that they don't exist, but we are constantly reading in the newspaper about people who have been scared to come forward, about people who haven't been able to access these resources. Just saying that some people in very liberal cities where there is a very strong liberal community are able to access this, and then people moving to their liberal, tolerant capital are able to leave Catholicism behind and leave out their queerness and be happy with it, isn't a reason on why everyone across the whole country is able to access it. And we actually see that where the abuse is most pernicious, it's also the areas where people have fewest access to the resources that you claim are already sufficient in the status quo, right? Because many people can't afford to just move to the capital or move to big cities where there is a large grassroots support for these people. And if you don't have access to the state-provided help, you won't even know that help is out there. You won't be able to access it, and that is where we are needed, right? But even if it were the case that there is already enough support in some areas, then presumably the state funding is going to go towards areas where that support doesn't already exist, or is going to strengthen and help the ones that are already providing this kind of support, because it is not in the interest of the state to compete with people who are already providing services effectively, but rather the interest of the state is to be a complement where these services are needed, which is similar to any other state, to any other help that the state is providing for people who need state assistance. The state doesn't just waste money throwing at people who don't need it. They specifically target out the people who need it, right? So I think there are a lot of benefits that people experience when leaving religion, especially in small small communities where the systematic power that religion has over people can be exploited a lot. And we see that is still the case in the status quo with all of these scandals coming out from Austria. And we see with all of the people who are LGBTQ and heavily oppressed in Poland, who is now setting up LGBTQ-free zones just because the religious people are heavily advocating for it and have the ear of the government and are able to convince them to do so, right? So I genuinely don't buy the claim that no one in any Western liberal democracy needs help accessing these resources, because clearly some people in some regions do, and that is what we are doing on our side of the house. We have explained to you that there is a need for this funding to an extent that individuals can't support, like an individual who has left religion can't just support the life of other people trying to live their religion until they find a job. We have explained to you why this is effective by offering counseling and resources. We have explained the benefits. Please propose.
I would like to thank the speaker very much for the speech. And now I would like to call upon the second speaker for the opposition.
Before I will start, when closing government offered POI to my partner, there was cutting off a little bit. So I think it might be hard for me to understood. So I'm just saying up front. It was like half of the POI was cut. I will try to engage with closing government. Just don't unmute yourself. And I will start my speech soon. Three, two, one. I think the abortion, like LGBT community, would be a good example why if state would do this upfront and fund that sort of things and flag this, that will get more imminent backlash, right? You know who you need to target. You can go there and you are going with the counter narrative and you are trying to defend your own side. Because every win on their side, every person who will successfully leave the religious community is a loss for this religious community, for religious leaders who are already facing massive decline of their movement and who still want to keep their power and who still want to keep their amount of believers. I will be talking about a couple of things. Firstly, about the higher burden which government need to take. Firstly, you will be using the taxpayers' money and you will be using probably a lot of resources. Second of all, if you want to reach to the people, if you need to tell them that the option is visible, you need to advertise this, but also you want to say that this is like the money which government is supporting, which means that it's unlikely that you will do this in like a very selected, targeted way, specifically because government didn't tell us that that will work with like the anonymity or you will be using like the special channels. They just assert that that will be done in a smart way. But second of all, it will not be secret, right? If there is massive decline already, and if you want to leave your community, you are probably consulting, specifically if they want to provide you resources to leave, if they want to give you a lot of information, it really needs to be like something which people can express. But second of all, and this is directly in the info slide, if you are promoting atheism, if you are promoting secularism, this is not something religious will agree on, right? This is no longer deregulating religion. This is no longer increasing the quality. This is no longer eliminating problematic parts. This is literally leaving the religion and supporting you, distancing yourself from this community, which change the perception which the government takes as a stand. Because for now, if you are subsidizing the church, if you are listening to these people, you are trying to say that there is still like a good values there, but we need to just change this. This is literally taking the opposite stance and relatively far more aggressive towards the religious leaders. No, thank you. I wanted to talk about a couple of things which Josh said and also response to opening government. Firstly, about like the legal protections and giving the tax breaks towards the church. Yes, and in the status quo, it's fine, right? Because you are showing that you are acknowledging that these people have a right to be there, that they have a lot of good values. It's unclear why now you will have legitimacy to adjudicate if these people are living the religion because they were heard there, or maybe they just want to go out, which means that you are showing that maybe the beliefs is not something which might be important for the people. But second of all, and most importantly, if you are seeing the state who is saying to people, please leave them, we will help you, we will provide you support, here is your alternative, please come to the atheist meeting, that doesn't guarantee you the support, right? That doesn't guarantee you the same community with the tangible benefits. I'm unclear where is the line between giving people the advices and telling them you can leave and giving them words of support to actually providing them financial stability in order to leave, or actually giving them ability to reconcile with their families. It's far more likely that you will be talking in the emotions and trying to be persuasive and trying to exaggerate the worst excesses of the religion, which means that even if you will leave, that's leaving you no chance in order to still being part and still talking to people who are religious, because it looks like you will try to indoctrinate them and even take them far away from the religion. The important piece of context is that they never characterize the religious leaders and who are the people who are trying to bring this community, right? There are a couple of challenges in the current context in terms of far more knowledge existing. It's that people like getting more exposures to the different cultures. It's like more progressive values with religion. It's not able yet to reform, which means that religious leaders already have a problem to keep people there, to still involve them, to being the active members, to still support them no matter what. If you will even try to take this part of people away, they will definitely coerced and implemented by the system. Because on this meeting, you are saying that wasn't your fault. That was someone like imposed on you that this is like a good belief. You have your freedom of choice. This is what you should do. And as an alternative, you are putting them to the another counter system, which is you should be atheist or you should be secular. You're literally still trying to create and impose on someone the way of belief. How that will be persuasive from people who just want to live the religion? It's a little bit unclear. But I think the most important part is the weighing in terms of the quantity of harms. Opening government never proved to which extent you will be able to actually help these people, how long term that will take. Presumably, there will be a lot of people, you will give them support, and then you will be like, we give you the infrastructure, we give you the knowledge, now you can leave and try to do something for yourself. Who will be funding them? Like, it's unclear if will you like give them the subsidiary. This is not something which these organizations will be likely to provide. But second of all, as well, in terms of how the people within these religions will be reacting, this is something which government never actually considered. And I think this is extremely big problem for the visibility and for the legitimacy, which state it's taking away and what sort of positions they are taking. Before I will move on, closing government quickly. Opening government.
By the powers of OG, we fiat the way we do this, and we say that the goal is not to convince people to turn away from religion, but just to catch and support the people who already have doubts or have decided to leave the religion.
Thank you. Good luck with the fiat in the this house believes that motion. This is not how you can fiat that will be implemented. You need to consider what is the current status quo, what are the current narratives, what will be the reaction of the people for implementing this. Lastly, for the variety of the states, specifically when the religious discourse in Western liberal democracies tend to be emotional and people have really strong opinions because you're literally attacking their identity. You're attacking what they are believing in. What is panel the most important part in this debate? Who are the people who are likely to leave the religious communities? Are people who were born in this, who had like a highly religious parents, who are in like a small conservative places and who believe that this is the only thing for them to do so. That people literally didn't learn or didn't execute it yet their power to like had a free will, and you are trying, you literally just shift them away and telling them this is the better alternative, this is the only legitimate alternative. The comparative is as follows. If you think, if you left the religious community was so much harmful, you are like philanthropists who want to support this, you are probably doing that by not official channels. You don't want to create like the backfires reaction. You don't want these people, the religious leaders needing to defend themselves. You don't want people to shit on the state and showing that this is illegitimate institution that will not approach your religious freedom. But also how you will be doubling down on people to not leave you, how you will include to your teaching and showing why the state is comparatively worst alternative, why you shouldn't trust them, and why they also undermining the legitimacy of people who raised you, the people who gave you everything in the first place, which create the direct harms to the people who might not leave this religion, which is massive quantity, and it creates the massive backlash between like the religious communities and the state. The perception is extremely important in that case. Opening up.
I would like to thank you very much for the speech. And now I'd like to invite the third speaker for the government.
Hi guys, can we be heard? I think that was
yeah, our connection has been like phasing in and out. I think
yeah, so I think it was a problem during the POI for me as well. So not only for but now it seems that everything is working.
Sorry, did they ask us for a POI? I'm sorry, never mind.
Okay, so I think if there's an issue with the live stream, or if I get stuck or something, just like kindly send a message on the chat. So we will stop and like reconnect or something. We have an alternative means of connection on standby, but hopefully we won't have to use that. Great, thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. Now it's good. Probably it will be fine, but yeah, good luck with internet.
Thanks. Okay, cool. All right. Sorry, POIs, I would prefer them. Actually, I think for this round, it's best if they come on the chat. I don't want to risk anything. Cool. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the debate so far is pretty messy, but also reasonably shallow. We think that what OO is basically telling us is 2 things. Firstly, that on their side of the house, they disagree not with religions themselves, because they agree that religions can be coercive and all the stuff, but they disagree with this particular mechanism. So we're going to address that particularly in our extension. The second real issue was this argument about backlash. Good for you. We have an extension on exactly why that backlash is going to be beneficial. We are fixing all of the holes in OG's case. We're going to one-up them as well. Okay. First, 3 points of extension. Firstly, in terms of victims themselves, there are 2 layers to this. The first layer is going to characterize exactly what these victims need. We felt like OG kind of glossed over this. While they did mention it, we think that there was a lack of depth to exactly what is necessary. We think for the vast majority of these people who are leaving really coercive religious groups, oftentimes their friends and family are deeply ingrained within these groups. And we agree, OG did mention that. But the problem is that what they need right now are people and support groups, right? So not just things like Reddit or awareness, in an abstract concept. What they need is someone to tell them they're not alone. What they need is for someone to actually be there in their darkest times. We think that uniquely, you are able to expand these organizations on our side when you have that government funding. The second thing we want to point out is a lot of these things are anxiety based. So we agree to an extent with OO when they say that a lot of times these individuals feel like a psychological suffering. They don't understand whether they're horrible people, whether they're going to hell or not. Oftentimes, what that means is that you're probably not going to read a Reddit post and get that entire thing changed. What you do need is some type of actual support. Here is why this particular mechanism of this organization is really, really important. It's because you can have human interaction. That is the most important thing in this round. We think that is a unique mechanism that OG didn't really highlight. The third thing we want to point out is that in terms of discussion, it is really, really important that you still have that, right? Because for some reason, OO was look, these people are really coerced and stuff, but at the same time, they're also likely to have access to social media and read all the current newspapers or whatever. We think that it is extremely difficult to get awareness to these people. That is why you need to try everything possible to help them. This is especially true given that both opening teams concede that these people do need help. Finally, OO asserts that look, all institutions are like this, and therefore you're going to you're going to be scared, right? I think that people can nuance the fact that it's not that they hate all institutions, it's that they hate institutions that take away their choice. We think that we can reasonably say that these institutions are not going to do that. Yeah.
One of the big problems to your case is that the ways in which you might talk to your community, the people whom you agree are super important to them, looks very different if it looks like the individual is coming of their own accord or from an independent institution versus as if it looks like they were sent by the state to be a vehicle for the state's doctrine, which is why the backlash is so much larger.
Cool. So that sounds really nice in a debating sense, okay, they're coming from different places and therefore they're going to be bad. But we don't think that the actual interaction is going to be as bad. Notice that oftentimes what these people will say is are you happy where you are? Do you need help? Are you someone who is suffering, right? Are they being abusive to you? Those are not harmful characterizations or harmful language at all. We think that that's a nice argument that works in debate theory, but doesn't really work in the practical world. The second layer's argument is where it's our most important extension. Why is it that the government is most necessary here, right? Note that the comparative is unlikely that you are going to give these organizations any support. 3 reasons. The first is that billionaires oftentimes fund a lot of these charities. We think that they are unlikely to fund these particular charities because A, they want to protect their reputation, but B, it seems as though these billionaires don't really care about religious indoctrination as much as other issues like global poverty. That means that you do not get very wealthy philanthropists on your side of the house in comparative. Secondly, it is hard to get funding because it's hard to get attention. Sure, you might have that news bulletin about this particular really harmful cult or whatever, but that doesn't actually trickle down into people being I should actually donate to some organization that's helping them. What What that means is the comparative in terms of small scale funding is highly unlikely. The impacts of that is that if you want to protect these people, that protection is vastly mitigated on their side of the house. The comparative we get is that we have government funding. That is a huge benefit that actually claims exactly what OG wants to talk about, because it is what's like the original mechanism that preempts that. The second extension we want to point out is a principal one. We think that the state exists as a safe net to protect people who are vulnerable, right? We think that this is a principle, like moral imperative of the state to protect them. OO says we are using taxpayer money. Precisely. The fact is that the police exists to protect people who are vulnerable. The fire department exists to protect people even if you are complicit in the fire that you created. Panel, these are the most vulnerable people you have in a country. It is ridiculous that the state like looks the other way and does nothing. We think it is really, really important that if the state provides you with 9/11 support, it should also provide you with this particular type of support. Given that like opening has agreed that this is a harm, it is unclear to me why the state should just do nothing. That is a moral claim that they have to defend. Finally, oftentimes the state is actually morally complicit in these actions. That is an additional moral imperative that they have to act. The third extension is on why discourse is important. OO says that look, discourse is like a bad thing that's going to be backlash or whatever. Firstly, we think that you are likely to break echo chambers on our side of the house. Note that the news is often saturated. That it means it is difficult to get airtime in a world where there are so many problems to cover. You are unlikely to get this kind of issue. But secondly, people find it difficult to actually change their minds about religion. We think that the fact that there has been so many sex abuse scandals against the Catholic Church, but people still do not really care, is example of the fact that people refuse to hold the religion accountable. Third, we think that if you are likely to have these discussions, that people within these religions are likely to actually hold their own leaders accountable, right? While yes, it is oftentimes difficult, you are incentivizing these people. The argument that look, all religious people are going to be angry or whatever is just poor analysis. We think that this nuanced response there to be a lot of people are moderates who will now want to change their religion from being extremely coercive to being better. That is a mechanism that we are willing to uniquely bring to you. Panel, what we want you to recognize is not only that we told you that the government is really, really important here because they bring in funding, but also the state cannot just look aside and do nothing when people are suffering. That is a moral claim that has no consequential bearing we're proud to propose.
I would like to thank the speaker very much for the speech, and I would like to call upon the third speaker for the opposition.
I'm audible, right?
Yep.
Okay, starting in a second. The lighting is. Do you want me to give you better lighting?
Oh, we don't have all day.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to make broadly 2 points in extension. Firstly, I'm going to characterize those organizations. And secondly, I'm going to talk about how this crowds out incentives for those organizations to be effective, but the point in which the state is an actor that's actively going to sabotage the efficiency of those organizations. Let's begin. First, let's characterize how those organizations are likely to look like. By virtue of the description of the motion itself, those organizations are not really dependent on money. And this is something that even none of GovBench actually proved. Why are they dependent on money? Often enough, they're only dependent upon the engagement of people who are qualified to help other people. That is to say, they have personally gone through this process, or they have an incentive because they have suffered a similar experience, and thus they're engaged in helping people by offering them the ability to be listened to and offering them practical advice because they have the same experience. Meaning those organizations often aren't really concentrated on financing, or even if they're concentrated on financing, it isn't to a huge extent. Note, secondly, this is a debate about liberal democracies in the Western world, meaning most of the extreme cases in which people are completely economically and socially entrenched don't exist, because Western societies are hugely and have a huge tendency to be more atheistic, or not to be majorly religious in their lifestyles, meaning the people who are really, really entrenched are like the Amish, and I'm not sure who anybody else. But like, thirdly, even if we take them at their best and say those people are in need of severe financial and social assistance, I'm not sure if this debate is again in Western democracies, why people who are materially struggling will not find help in like state-run welfare programs. Why is this characterization important? Firstly, because it points out that they never prove the uniqueness and the necessity of money in those organizations. But secondly, it is important because it frames the debate about the willingness of people to engage with those organizations, that is to say, to have competent people who have experienced personally that in order to help those people. Now, why is any of this important? This is my second point. We think that the state has like pervasive incentives and it's actually going to hurt those organizations. Why is that the case? We think that this is the case, firstly, at the point in which the state, at the point in which this policy is basically giving funds, certain politicians or certain political parties giving funds, this means it expects results. That is to say, for them to be re-elected and for them to bolster their image, this means that this policy has to be successful in terms of numbers of people who are converted or in terms of messaging in media in order to show that something is being done and this money is being spent at the point at which this is a funding that is coming from the state. But I think this is particularly problematic at the point at which at first this is likely to result in acts of performance. That is to say, this is likely to manifest in firstly an increase in short-term tactics that like weaponize scandalousness and visibility while not really achieving anything else. That is to say, more demonstrations, or instead of waiting for people to come to you, actively engaging with them. Or like thirdly, notice using more aggressive rhetoric in order to get in the news, or like using more aggressive rhetoric, because even though this debate is about like those organizations, there is no guarantee that those organizations are like actually going to convert people from the majority of religions. That is to say, at the point at which the state has certain tendencies by virtue of the existence of right-wing parties that hate minorities or hate the religions of those minorities, this is likely to be funding coming from certain states that have incentives to discriminate and to be aggressive against certain minority religions, meaning in turn at the point at which the state influences those actors, the rhetoric is bound to be more aggressive. We think this is hugely problematic because it basically manifests in acts of performance. And secondly, in higher expectations of success. That is to say, in prioritizing tactics that have short-term validity in terms of showing that this policy is effective, but also in actively coercing people to opt out of those religions and discriminate and like trying to pursue them to opt out. We think this is hugely problematic on its own. But secondly, there's a second layer of why the state is problematic, because at the point in which this is a state policy, this means that firstly, there will be state people who don't have the personal experience and like competence to run those organizations, who are going to be intervening by virtue of wishing to have influence over like the organizations to which they gave money. Or secondly, they're going to be created separate state organizations that serve this function, meaning that those organizations that existed to begin with will now have to compete with funds in order to exist in comparison to those organizations, which we think is hugely problematic. Why is this hugely problematic? It is hugely problematic because, like, as I already told you, firstly, the state is more bureaucratic in the way in which it functions, and it prioritizes short-term goals of seeing like visible results, even though they're not like long-term essential. I think that secondly, the state and its actors don't have the actual experience to help those people at the point in which even CG themselves concede that those organizations are uniquely effective because we have experienced people who have gone through this, who you find trustworthy, and who you can engage with. But we think that finally, this is negative at the point in which it crowds out all the positive like values that currently exist in those organizations. That is to say, they are not profit. They are orientated in helping people and feeling better about yourself because you helped a person who is going through similar situations as you. At the point in which you basically bring monetary incentives and incentives for external results, that is to say, for you to achieve a certain amount of coercion, of like conversions of people to opt out of those religions, will create pervasive incentives within the people who already existed within those organizations, which we all think is hugely problematic at the point in which it sabotages the activity of those organizations. Before I continue, I'll take a point from opening.
Your logic applies mostly to private run things. However, if we look at government services, governments have an incentive to run it in a way that doesn't alienate people. And we don't see police crowding out private security. We measure them by bad outcomes averted. Why would this be run differently?
I think like, as I already mentioned, those mechanisms are unique to religion. And secondly, as I already mentioned, specific in Western liberal democracy, in which there is a tendency for like political organizations to wish to repress minority religions by like harsher rhetoric. So we think this is unique to our side. And why is any of this harmful? Firstly, notice that like conversion is a tough process. That is to say, you basically have to separate your personal, like who you were before. That is to say, you as a religious person with a certain identity, with social networks and certain habits and traditions, organize, which means this is a choice, especially when people are often enough risk averse, especially about such life-changing experiences. People are risk averse, meaning it has to be a choice that you make yourself. That is to say, this is a choice that doesn't have to be coerced. And secondly, this choice must come with an adequate alternative. That is to say, you must adequately trust the alternative. That is to say, those organizations to help you transition and to help you lead a different life. This doesn't happen at the point at which those organizations are first going to be crowded by people who don't have the same personal experiences. That is to say, the state agents. But like secondly, at the point at which they are actively demotivating and preventing people who actually have those experiences from engaging in those organizations. Or like thirdly, at the point at which the organization is associated with like scandalous atheist protests and other aggressive rhetoric in order to recruit people. But like finally, this is important because it's basically going to like force people to opt out of religions, even though they wouldn't have done it, or they would have done it on a later date because it wishes to maximize results. Meaning at the end of the day, this organization is less effective because it doesn't protect the values that it was founded upon, and it actually coerces people more. So I think for all those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank Speaker much for a speech. And now, to sum up the debate side of the government, I'd like to call upon the last speaker for the government.
Yeah, just give us a bit of time. I just want to make sure the Wi-Fi is reset.
Sorry, you cut off a bit. I think that's probably what you were asking
Yeah,
about.
sorry, we're just trying to get the Wi-Fi.
Can you guys hear us?
Yes.
Good to go.
Yep.
Three, two, one. Chairperson and members of the House, we think that our closing counterpart missed a couple of things. One, they missed the analysis that we think our opening half gave us when they talked about how, look, governments will focus A, around efficacy, B, this is going to be in a majority of instances in funding. So we think all the analysis about bureaucracies and bureaucratic inefficiencies don't necessarily apply in this debate because A, the character of the organization is still fundamentally its own. B, the fundamental fact that like, look, this like money is actually effective and you want these organizations to actually be effective with the way they do things. So I have two major clashes in which I'm going to kind of analyze how contributions in this debate should be assessed. And they are twofold. So the first is essentially on the ability to influence and backlash. And our second point of clash is essentially going to be on why government necessarily has been like completely ignored also by our closing half, and also nobody has brought it up in the debate. So moving on to the first clash. One thing that we need to understand is, are these people comparatively better off? So when you have these organizations present and they do actually receive funding, what are the positive benefits you are going to accumulate? Now, we think that this is very, very simple. And I apologize if I come off as offensive, but we think that the earlier speaker from side opening or our opening diagonal essentially has a slightly privileged experience because we think that you're able to economically deal with the situation and you don't necessarily have to separate from your parents. You take that for an example anywhere else, like say, for example, within the Amish community where you're not even exposed to technology, or like just literally anywhere else where social media feeds are like super indoctrinating. We don't think people have that same kind of access. And it's not to be offensive anyway, but we just don't think that that's something that plays out across a majority of people's lives because we think that a lot of them don't come from solid income backgrounds. And we think that that's an element that definitely needs to play a role in this debate. Now, that is the first thing that we want to point out. Now, we're also filling in the gaps that were kind of pointed out by our closing counterpart when they said, like, look, how does money necessarily translate into things being effective? Now, one of the things that we think that money does is, A, it just gives you the resources and support networks. A very, very good example of this is sort of the Mormons in Utah, right? Where essentially the community itself, because you're so ingrained and you don't have any other sort of opportunities to pursue your economic like well-being, We think that those people suffer extremely from not being able to interact with society, not knowing what to do. And we think that those people are especially important in this debate, because also note that these people are fundamentally ignored. They don't actually make it onto social media because they probably don't have the access that they need to do that, or they don't speak in the same vernacular that, like, I suppose people from the cosmopolitan community speak when it comes to coming out about these kind of things. And we think that those individuals are fundamentally ignored under essentially our opening halves. And we think that's unfortunate in this debate. We needed to point it out. Now, the central question here is that when we do get comparatively better benefits, right, which we think is a given in this debate, because we do think that funding enables organizations to do things like outreach programs, to sort of hire people to help them with their marketing, that sort of thing is extremely important. Now, let's get on to the idea of backlash. Now, I think one of the most unfortunate assumptions that we got from our opening counterpart is essentially like, look, the analysis is that, like, look, liberalization is the trend, which is true to a certain extent, but not exclusively the story. Because what we fundamentally see within religious organizations is that they are getting better at inoculating themselves against liberal propaganda. We see this in the rise in misinformation and sort of manipulating, like, essentially social media algorithms, trying to make it more clickbaity, etc. We see those sort of trends of inoculation. So we don't think that the liberalizing trend that you're talking about is necessarily going to carry over into people. And we think that's a characterization that was unfortunately missed in the debate. Like, we're not like debating this in 2015, we're debating this now, where misinformation is a significant issue and social media manipulation is a significant issue. So we think that that's a unique thing that was unfortunately left out by Right. Now, let's move on to the other things we have in this debate. Now, what was their argumentation based on? Their argumentation on backlash, well, fundamentally, it's necessary to actually engage with these groups, right? Because they are being isolated, inoculation is getting better. The only way you do this is when you have people at you need a concerted effort to break these people out, right? If you want to break through algorithms in the way that they're structured in terms of a person's social media feed, you need to run through like hell for that, all right? You need to have people doing metadata analysis. You need that sort of funding. You need that people giving you that edge. And we think that, unfortunately, that is something that was ignored in this debate. Now, what was their argument reliant on? Their argument was reliant on, sorry, I didn't see your POI. In a minute. Their argument was reliant on the idea that, like, look, essentially, it's going to be on perception manipulation. We think that religions already view atheists in an antagonistic way. They already try to frame them out as viciously as possible. We don't think there's going to be a dramatic increase in terms of the antagonism that these groups have towards atheism, because we don't think it's like, oh, look, this is the perception of the state. Now, again, one thing that we want to point out, a lack of clash in analysis, because we pointed out that, look, these organizations do want to be effective. They don't want to stir the pot too much. They balance these sort of things out. And so again, OO's analysis not dealing with like opening governments analysis, and like opening governments analysis not including like analysis on like finances. But before that, yes, your point.
We take a much higher burden than our closing by showing why that even if these organizations are well-intentioned and act well, 5 reasons why it is that believers turn away, which both impedes the momentum that we see organically in the status quo and creates macro-political consequences like legal justification to change school curriculum.
So, okay, that analysis was like really nice, but we don't think it comes across, again, I just want to repoint this out, the inoculation mechanism that currently religious organizations use. That is why that analysis is outdated. It was earlier, yes, you know what, you do have a certain amount of backlash, but now that's kind of irrelevant because backlash is the medium of social media. You want to garner it as much as possible, so you will create outrage. So regardless of whether they are perceived as doing it or not, the state will always be framed as the enemy when it comes to these religious organizations. And we think that's an element in this debate that was unfortunately not engaged with. Now, moving on to what our analysis was, which again, not developed in the debate because like nobody kind of engaged with it from our like closing, but essentially, why do states have this imperative? We talked to you about how, look, essentially states need to do this in the first place. No engagement on the moral imperative. And one thing we need to point out, while there is, yes, a consequentialist bias within the debating community, you need to carry through on that. You need to tell us why your consequences outweigh the principle of why the state needs to do this in a particular way. And thereby we think we win this debate because we proved to you that this was a necessary action for the state to in fact take. Now, again, another levels of analysis of this. This does not exist in a vacuum. This is also for the self-preservation of the state, because you understand that, again, this is how you use faith mechanisms to sort of propagate right-wing populism. And in that instance, we think that these democracies also have a self-preservation imperative to actually make sure that they're well off. So what have we done for you in the debate? We had to clear up like the murkiness of like our openings, but the thing that we contributed to was why the state needs to fundamentally do this. Please side with side closing. Thank you. Government.
I would like to thank Speaker for a speech, and now I'd like to call upon the last speaker for the opposition.
Yes, I'm about to start. I'm Protestant, so this motion makes no fucking sense to me. Open your phone so I can time. No, okay. Thank you so much. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. I'll do CG for like a minute, then I'll go to OG, then I'll do OO. But firstly, CG. CG essentially say 3 things. The first is that you need to talk to people in order to get actual success. 3 responses to this. 1, this is asserted. There is no reasoning why this is true. Presumably, it could be just as impactful to read someone else's story or to read like them giving practical reasons why you must do this. I don't understand why you need human interaction. This is just asserted. The second thing is that this is largely symmetrical, and this is not contingent on money. And this is something we said in the first speech. Most people that will do this on either side of the house are likely to, how do you call it, volunteer in this way, right? People who used to be in a religion are likely to volunteer, to share their stories and to do all these sorts of things. This is not contingent on money, meaning that their benefit, like they cannot access it. Third thing, and this is, we recognize all say this, this speech will be like kind of cooperating with all Balkan power with Claudia. Oh no, she's not Balkan, fuck. Okay, the third thing is that there exist other like methods where you can talk to people. Things like online forums where you can share your stories, where you can talk to these sorts of people and all these things, right? Sorry, Poland is on Balkan, I'm sorry. And you can access all these sorts of things, which means that the uniqueness of this being predicated upon these sorts of charities is just false. The second thing they say is that you need funding. Twofold response on this. One, there are other forms of funding and they did not engage with these sorts of things, right? There are people who want to personally donate to these sorts of things because like, they like it and because they used to be in this sort of religion. And no, they are far better than the state in this sort of way because A, they have been personally through this, which gives them a unique perspective on what is good to do in this sort of way, which isn't through the state. But secondly, their incentives are far less short-termistic and problematic than the state, which will explain why they have bad incentives later on. But the second point on this is just not true, right? Many of the good mechanisms you can access have nothing to do with money, right? There are, again, people volunteering, but there are also people writing their stories for fucking free, right? You don't commission them to do this. And there are people in general sharing and helping you throughout these ways. Like they can make you, they can allow you to like crash on their couch. And this doesn't cost money to the state, right? So you can access a shit ton of their benefits without doing this specifically in money way. And like these resources, as all said, already exist. There are even maybe versions of these charities that exist in status quo, but they aren't as money dependent and they don't get their money from the state. Third thing they say is state has good incentives because firemen. This was essentially the reasoning that came out from CG member. The reason why state often does not have good incentives, and fuck it, I'll just go to OG and explain this. I'm going to OG now. What OG say is these sort of places are smart and therefore they will do this in a good way. This comes out 30 seconds into their PM. Here is why they are not smart and here is why they will not do this in a good way. The reason is they're pressured by the state to do things that are bad for them. Before I explain why they're pressured, here's why the state pressures them into doing things that are bad for them. Note, A, the state has a hugely short-termistic, how do you call it, interest in effectiveness, right? The state doesn't care what happens to the people you interact with 20, 30 years from now, because this won't be when these sort of representatives are elected. But secondly, the state has the incentive to like showcase the action that you're doing something that often even takes precedent to effectiveness, right? Because like people are more likely to see, yeah, this happened in the news, they engaged in some sort of demonstration or something, to read the actual number of the people they helped, and they're like unable to make a comparison between how it would be without the state and how it is with the state. The reason why the state has this incentive is because they need to justify this money, right? Often when you make budgeting changes, you need to justify spending this money in this way and not in comparative other ways. So you have incentive to like do this. Why does this mean that you pressure these things to do, that you pressure these things to do bad things? So sorry, this is very Balkan moment. You pressure the things to do bad things because they compete for money, because there are many different charities, but a limited amount of money, which means that there is a race to the bottom to, how do you call it, to mitigate your own interest to get this money. The reason you prioritize getting your money, this money, if you're a charity, than like being effective, is because you often care about your people more. You care about keeping the lights on. You care about hiring more people. You think that you alone can solve this, but you also rationalize, if I don't take this money, someone else will take this money, right? So you have an incentive to, how do you call it, sacrifice your own effectiveness to take state money and then to do really shitty things. Then Let's take OG case at their best, though. They say these things are good. Firstly, why they are not good. Secondly, even why they're good, why we win. Firstly, why they are not good. No, they have incentives to do really bad things. How do you call it? Public demonstrations are bad on two levels. One, they decrease these sorts of things' effectiveness, meaning that they decrease your ability to engage with them because you see, yes, these people personally attack you. They use more aggressive rhetoric. It's unlikely this will happen on our side. But the second reason why this is bad, even if we assume that effectiveness is the ultimate goal, the reason why this is bad is this means the people who don't leave are now more radicalized and now perceive that they're being more attacked. And this is, I'll explain later, it's far more specific than OO's case of, oh, they perceive the state is coming after them. Spoiler alert, churches already fucking think the state is going after them, but we'll get to this. But the second reason why they're not good and why they often do bad things is they coerce people into leaving when it is not a good idea for them. They lie to them. They tell to them, yes, leave, your life is amazing, you face no challenges, because they have incentives to get those conversions up, because they have incentives to do short-term effectiveness as opposed to improving these people's lives in the long run. And these people are often harmed. They would be better off if they stayed. But before I go on to make this comparative, Oji.
Okay. The people who make most of the day-to-day decisions about how these organizations run are not the people who audit them at the end of the year. They're the people who've devoted their life to it. They care about helping actual people leave their religion because there's no scarcity of them. No team on office proving scarcity. They help actual people because they're doing it out of the goodness of their hearts.
Yes,
Don't ignore our fucking case.
People really like helping, but they also really like for their charity to still run. They want to help people. Parts of the people they want to help are the people who fucking work for their charity. Note that this is just trivially true. Charities compromise what they want all the time to get funds because they tend to prioritize their own people who are closest to them and helping them, especially when many of them are people who have exited the religion, right? So you like to prioritize it over doing bad things. But okay, let's quickly make the comparative with OG and explain why we beat OO. The comparative is even on their side, more people are helped. Here is why this loses out on our side, because the most scandalous people, the people who are LGBTQ but abused, the people who are like the most hurt by this are likely to leave anyways, right? They likely change minds on people on the margins. What we do is like our benefits apply irrelevant of who gets out, because people get out when it is not a good idea for them, because people get generally more radicalized and effectiveness is decreased, meaning that we take this comparative even if we presume a slight increase in effectivity. Okay, here's why we beat OO. OO's only mechanism outside of clearing church and state is, but this will lead to backlash because the state interferes in religion. One, state already interferes, churches already perceive state interferes with religion. They fund abortion clinics, which they literally think is like funding degeneracy. But the second thing is they lie, right? Like churches lie to you and they tell you the state is after you, they want to take you down in all these sorts of ways, meaning that their mechanism is non-unique, whereas our mechanism is unique. But secondly, even if it is true that there exists some sort of backlash, people can presumably still access other options that are not associated with backlash, whereas we prove that this specific option is predicated on harm, and this specific option leads to bad things, which means that we take a higher burden than win, vote us.
I'd like to thank you very much for the speech and everyone for this debate.